the United States and China in the 21st century. Mr. Blumenthal's forthcoming book, The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, will be released on November 17th, but is available for pre-order on Amazon right now. Even as China pursues great national ambitions, its future appears increasingly dystopian. Recently, COVID-19 cast a glaring light on Beijing's political pathologies. This is a book about China's grand strategy and its future as an ambitious, decaying, and dangerous rival. China both exercises its strength and power to undermine the United States and afflicts the world with its internal weaknesses and maladies. We will allot the first 20 minutes or so this afternoon for Mr. Blumenthal to give his remarks and then move right into questions from the moderators and the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please submit it in writing using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll end the event promptly at 5:30 Eastern Time. Lastly, we'd like to thank our sponsor for this event, the American Enterprise Institute's Executive Council program. The AEI Executive Council at Yale works to advance campus dialogue about public policy and introduce students and faculty to the scholarship of the American Enterprise Institute. And if you'd like to learn more or apply to join the council, you can email me at jasper.bors@yale.edu. Now we'll turn it over to Dan Blumenthal.
Well, thank you very much to the hosts of the Buckley program and AEI, of course, and thank you very much to all of you for participating and calling in today. So when my new book coming out in November is put in those terms, it sounds rather stark and harsh. I actually lived in China and visited all over China, and have great respect for China's history and culture and its people and so on. But the U.S. today is in a geopolitical rivalry with China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's unlike anything this country has ever faced before, because China is not. It's dynamic. Its economic growth until recently, the last few years, has been extraordinary. It is ambitious. It's enjoyed a seat as the Middle Kingdom, as a central power for much of its history, and it's deeply enmeshed in the international system, as well as enmeshed with the United States. So this is not like anything we've seen before. And as Jasper Bors said before, from the introduction or to my book, that it's also so China's it's also that when the scale is so big that when China has a problem or a COVID, for example, and it goes about trying to cover it up or censor information, it affects all of us now. So it's posing a twofold problem for the United States. One is the projection of its power and its ambition, and the second is the maladies within the system that cannot be contained because of China's deep enmeshment in international life. So let me just, before we get to information and disinformation, which is a key part of Chinese strategy and part of the competition, let me just sort of go through this whole idea of what is it that we're competing over with China. And I think it has to begin with the notion that the United States didn't seek this competition, this rivalry, these problems. In fact, particularly since the 1980s, late 1970s, it sought quite the opposite. It sought to build up China as a great power and benefit from its economic growth and help it ascend to the World Trade Organization and other international institutions and open up its market, its scientific laboratories and so on to China. And in that sense, the grand strategy of engaging China that began under Richard Nixon was a huge success on those terms. China is far richer, far healthier, far more enmeshed in the international system, and far more technologically advanced. But during that time in the 1990s, China started the Chinese Communist Party. I hesitate to speak for all of China, obviously, started to view the United States as a rival, as a threat. It faced a dilemma because on the one hand, it benefited from the international order that the U.S. had helped construct and lead. It benefited economically. It benefited from the U.S. provision of what we call public goods, particularly in the maritime arena. But it started after the Tiananmen Square protests, which the Chinese brutally put down, and started to view the United States as implacably hostile to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, and started to compete with us. That on top of the U.S. unipolar moment, the hyperpower that the U.S. was with no rival in the 1990s, watching the United States go to war in the first Gulf War in 1991, go to war in the Balkans, Kosovo, in the second Gulf War, watching U.S. Unbridled supremacy really scared the Chinese as well. And so what we started to notice in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when I was at the Pentagon, is Chinese military capabilities were on a very big and ambitious modernization program, and that was starting to bear fruit. And they were clearly viewing us as their main competitor, their main threat. So they were building up capabilities militarily to neutralize our advantages militarily and to neutralize and to defeat us over time if it ever came to a conflict. Let me just state at the outset that neither the United States nor China seek conflict, seek war. Both know how destructive it would be. But of course, militaries are positioning and posturing in case one does break out or unfold. So we first noticed the military aspects of this competition, troubling military investments from our perspective. Obviously, the Chinese view our posture in Asia as troubling as well. And you really started to see competitive dynamics take hold in the military arena, particularly over the Taiwan Strait, which China views Taiwan as a province of China, as a rogue province, as a vestige of the Civil War in China, as an embarrassment that Taiwan's not part of China as we speak right now. And the United States obviously views Taiwan very differently. So the main arena of military competition, military deterrence, military signaling is still over the Taiwan Strait, although in the first decade of the 21st century, we started to see China push hard on its territorial ambitions in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, putting it into contestation with U.S. allies such as Japan, Australia, as well as some of the Southeast Asian nations, two of which we have allied treaties with, Thailand and the Philippines, and others which we have started to build better relations. So right there, I described the contours of a competition. So there's military posturing, there's pushes on maritime territories, and then there's the U.S. Response, which is to try to tighten the alliances in those areas. So you can put it in many different terms, the fault lines in many different terms, but you can certainly say, well, this is about U.S. maintaining and building alliances, and the Chinese trying to break them by sending out a signal that the U.S. is not a reliable partner, that it's China's home turf, that China also offers many benefits to the region that the U.S. cannot economically. And so a mix from China's perspective of coercion and inducements. But here's also where the informational aspect comes into play, because China's view of information, just generally, it's an extremely holistic view. So there isn't the same separation in Chinese thinking, doctrine, activity that the United States and other Western democracies have with respect to there's a realm for commercial and private and non-governmental information policies, and then there's a realm for governmental military, information operations, and so on. It's much broader than that in China because, generally speaking, the Chinese view information coming in from other sources outside of China as threatening and hostile. So and polluting the messages of the Chinese Communist Party. So the approach to information is very broad, from putting out new rules that call for something called internet sovereignty. The nations have absolute sovereignty over the information coming in, obviously extremely different than the United States or other democracies. So it goes all the way from new rules with respect to how information is passed from country to country, or attempted new rules, all the way to the more sharp end of the stick, in the sense of information warfare, information operations, the attempt by China to develop capabilities successfully, we think, or we may even know, to neutralize U.S. advantages by should a conflict, should any type of conflict come to pass, being able to blind the United States and distort its use of information networks, based networks, internet-based networks, cyber networks, and so on. So it's really a holistic approach in China towards information dominance, they call it. Then there's also sort of the more traditional, let's call it Russian style, information propaganda campaigns. The difference between Russia and China in this regard is that China has more money, and but it's not as aggressive. So China is not as directly aggressive. So China, for example, has bought and built many global media companies throughout the world. Probably many of you are aware of some of these and have seen them in your newspaper, in inserts in your newspapers and elsewhere. And those are arms of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese state, meant to send out messages about China's benign nature. In fact, now contrasting its benign nature with the U.S. supposedly overbearing and militaristic and hegemonic nature. Those are the key themes that Chinese media and Chinese information pass forth within the region, in Asia, and increasingly in the United States itself. The other aspect of information in this context of strategic competition is the attempts that more countries are undercovering, including the United States, at political subversion. I think at networks of party officials and others to try to mobilize sentiment towards China. Countries such as Australia, which you can do a search on, Australia and Chinese party political subversion, have uncovered many of these networks. There's a big information component to that as well. New Zealand, Taiwan, increasingly the United States. During COVID-19, we saw some efforts to change and intensify with respect to information competition, information statecraft. China did begin for the first time to use Russia-style disinformation targeted at the United States. So making claims in English media and social media that the US was behind and responsible for bringing COVID to China, making claims that the United States was about to engage in a full country lockdown when it wasn't. Other types of misinformation, more Russian style, meant to sow panic and division inside the United States. Sometimes very crude, as many of you probably watched in terms of Twitter feeds and so forth from the Chinese government. But this was new. There reportedly is more cooperation among China, Russia, and Iran on some of these more direct propaganda and misinformation types of activities. Again, the purpose is to make the United States look and act more weak than it is, to propagate the Chinese message that it's going to be a better global leader. It's inevitable. Make countries in the region, U.S. allies, and so forth, just kind of lose faith and give up on the United States enduring power. So information is extremely important to China. And of course, very importantly, given the level of sort of Chinese Communist Party paranoia about its own well-being, to censor information as well, which had a huge effect on the world and during COVID-19, because much of the medical information was censored quickly. And so the U.S. didn't have, or the rest of the world didn't have much to go on in terms of what this pandemic really could mean. So I couldn't emphasize this enough. The Chinese attempts at censorship inside China, the scale of China is so big that it affects the rest of the world. So also the market is so big. So for example, just something in popular culture, the National Basketball Association, right? So huge. So China's, I'd say, desire to cut off what we would call First Amendment, free speech rights, actually has its effect throughout the world, because of the threat that one would lose the market share or market access if one says things, even in the United States, that go against the Chinese Communist Party line. So this is fairly new. And I said before, we've never faced anything like this before at that scale. So a country that doesn't just push disinformation, but is able to get people in the United States and elsewhere throughout the world to change what they say in the United States based on what access to the China market. Let me conclude, because I think we're getting to the 20-minute mark with a few comments. So one has to see information control, information operations as part in the context of a larger U.S.-China competition. China does believe, from a military standpoint, that this is the U.S.'s weak point. It's too overly reliant on information networks, cyber networks, space networks, in order to conduct military operations successfully. It believes that technologically, the U.S. is not ahead of China in new emerging technologies that use and sort information, like artificial intelligence and data science. So it does believe it has room to get ahead of the United States in those areas, which would have military application as well as coercive application. The competition at the end of the day between the United States and China is mostly in East Asia, about who's going to be the prime power in that region with the most influence. In this sense, the United States is a status quo power. It believes that its alliances, its position in that critical region, have been useful not just to the United States, but to the other countries in the region. China doesn't think so anymore. But the competition is increasingly spreading out to other parts of the world. Europe, because of its market, Europe, because of its technology, Europe, because of its own views on information and data privacy, is a key theater as well. And not as key as the alliances in Asia, but key as well. And the fault lines of the competition are, military, the different views about the uses and abuses of information, diplomatic campaigns, alliances versus breaking alliances, or alliances versus the building, as the Chinese say, of new strategic partnerships, which we can get into more, the whole One Belt, One Road initiative. So eventually now the Chinese are also trying to bend basic rules of the international order more to its preferences and more to be compatible with the Chinese Communist Party. The competition, as we've seen recently, has moved into areas such as the World Health Organization, UN bodies, standard-setting bodies for technology, and so on. And the U.S. On this part of the competition has been wholly unprepared, as well as some of the political subversion. It's been wholly unprepared for that. COVID really brought it to the fore, and the U.S. is trying to catch up and see what it must do in order to maintain its position in the world order and the world order itself. Well, hopefully I've given you enough to think about for a question and answer period. We can get into many different aspects and dimensions of some of the problems I stated, but it's been my pleasure to talk to you so far. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Blumenthal. That was a fascinating lecture, and I'm excited to continue the conversation. Jasper and I are going to start off with a few questions of our own. I just wanted to give a quick reminder to the audience to go ahead and if you have any question, to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, which you should see in your lower bar, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. I see we have a good number coming in already. My question for you was, it's become a more mainstream statement over the past few years to say that the U.S. and China are in a sort of lowercase c Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And many have said that it's within both countries' best interest, even with competition, to find areas to cooperate and not be actively working against each other economically. So, we've seen over the past few years things like the trade deals. And I'm curious whether or not you think, or at least to what degree you think, that the disinformation specifically about the United States that China propagated during this pandemic is going to have long-term effects and potentially significantly move our relationship backwards, and maybe put us into less of a cooperative relationship than in the past few years.
Well, great question. There are a lot in that question. So let me start with COVID and Chinese behavior during COVID setting us back. I think on a bipartisan basis throughout the United States, the attitudes about China have really hardened, and I don't think there's any going back. There may be a climb down and a cooling off, but I think people throughout the country and people throughout the world and people inside the Congress and the administration are furious about COVID and China's role in it, in making it worse. So I don't think, and many just see it as sort of an unmasking of the behavior of some malign activities. So I don't see us going back. Cooperation is very important. Cooperation is obviously different than a deliberate engagement strategy. An engagement strategy was meant to socialize China, to tame China, to shape China into something else. Cooperation is important. We have to avoid conflict. We have to avoid war. We need mechanisms of high diplomacy to ensure that we're not headed in that direction. What makes this so different than the Cold War is sometimes our economic goals with respect to China are different than our national security goals. And I'll just give you a quick example. So if we had gotten everything we asked for in phase one talks of the trade deal, which would have been a reform and restructuring of the Chinese economy, the truth of the matter is the Chinese would have started to grow much faster economically. And so there are trade-offs, obviously, there between national security goals of fearing ascending China and economic and well-being goals of wanting China to be a driver of global growth. That'll be a continuing dilemma that we won't solve for a very long time.
Great. So I had read this past week in the National Interest about this group of teenagers who are called the Accelerationists, or who call themselves that. And their objective is to make the party enforce all of its own rules and kind of destroy it from the inside. I'm wondering if, as you say, China is in the state of institutional decay and there's a lot of stagnation within the system. Is this, could this be an effective way of bringing it to its knees?
Well, I'd say that plus a lot of other types of activities that Chinese resistors, let's call them, are trying to effectuate could cause more severe fissures and fractures in the party system. So what China's trying to avoid, and its thesis and its conclusions about why the Soviet Union collapsed, was that the party fractured and the elite stopped believing in its purposes. So since Tiananmen Square, when there were big divisions in the Chinese Communist Party's attitudes towards the protests, the Chinese have worked assiduously to the party elite has worked assiduously to remain together, and so any hint of elite dissatisfaction or siding with one of these groups, as you mentioned, which I know less about, or with some of the recent examples of Chinese tycoons or others being kicked out of the party, is a matter of great concern for the Chinese party, and is a symptom, I think, of more fracturing and decay at elite levels than is commonly known.
Thank you. We are going to move into a few questions from our audience now, if that's okay with you, Mr. Blumenthal.
Yeah.
The first one from an audience member says, the Buckley program was fortunate to hear from Michael Pillsbury and Gordon Chang last year on China. Where do you see your opinions paralleling their thoughts, and where do they perhaps diverge?
I don't want to characterize. I don't know what they said last year. I think they're both great scholars. I just don't. I don't know how to answer that because I don't know what they said. So it's hard to characterize what they said at a particular point in time. Dr. Pillsbury in particular has been at the forefront in the 90s in particular of translating Chinese strategic works, which have been extremely helpful. But I'm not sure I can characterize their positions right now. Sorry.
Okay. I did have one more actually from the same individual that says, what are the, kind of looking forward to the 2020 election, what do you see as the most important differences with regards to the approach to China between President Trump and candidate Joe Biden?
Well, in some important ways, we know where both of them stand because Vice President Biden has been in Washington for decades and has been much more of a traditionalist on China, supporting the engagement strategy for most of his career. Under President Obama, there were the beginnings of some resistance to that engagement policy and to China, particularly in the South China Sea and in other areas. But President Trump sort of disrupted the whole policy and then started a whole new conversation in Washington about competition and confrontation. But I think with President Trump, you'd see him kind of going back and forth, trying to figure out how much confrontation, how much competition, but how much does he want, a trade deal at the end of the day that in his view deals with the most important issue for him is trade deficits with respect to the trade deal, whereas his negotiators have a lot of other economic concerns. But his concerns are economic in the main. With Vice President Biden, it remains to be seen how much he has changed on China and how much he will remain committed to the competition policy that he's talking about now.
So another audience member is curious about Confucius Institutes and would like to know, I guess, if Yale has one. Yale does not have a Confucius Institute, but they ask, how do Confucius Institutes fit into China's plans? How significant are they? And I might add the corollary of asking, how influential do you think all of this recent scholarship on Confucius and ancient Chinese philosophy has been for the development of China's grand strategy?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Confucius Institutes are mainly there was some aspect of them that for a while did provide colleges that were underserved with Chinese language, certain capabilities to teach Chinese language and culture and so on. But they are at the end of the day a tool of political influence, to propagate themes of Chinese Confucianism, that China has a benign nature and a civilization that should be shown respect, and in many ways it should. I mean, in terms of Chinese civilization, in terms of, but they're tools of political influence and influence on attempts to influence our education system. The second question with respect to Confucian and Chinese grand strategy. So I would encourage everyone to apply for my summer course at the Hertog Foundation called Chinese Grand Strategy, because we do dissect the Hertog Foundation's advanced political studies program. We do dissect various influences on current Chinese grand strategy. One of them is this sort of civilizational aspect, which goes back to dynastic China, at least during the Qing dynasty. And obviously, these cultural influences are still there with respect to Chinese strategic culture, with respect to elite learning of the Confucian and other strategic classics. Maybe not dominant, but still very much part of the Chinese strategic culture, cultural DNA.
Thank you again, Mr. Blumenthal. This is kind of a shorter question, but it is very relevant to your book, so I'm sure you'd like to talk about it. This question says, your new book mentions decay with regards to China. Can you talk a little bit more about how exactly it's decaying and what you mean by that?
Yeah. So decay, the institutional decay. I mean, so you have this one party there was a communist revolutionary party, and that was its legitimacy. That was its, that was its reason for existing, and Mao's continuous revolutions and so forth. And it started to create a problem with that when Deng Xiaoping, who obviously restored China, introduced markets and market capitalism. So they came up with formulations that make no sense in many ways. China is for a socialist market economy, or China is for socialism with Chinese characteristics. Some people call it state-led capitalism. But it's difficult. It's increasingly difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to explain its sources of legitimacy, not just explain its sources of legitimacy, but to avoid atrophy and pull dynamic forces into the party when people don't have a good sense of what that party stands for. Some of the institutional decay also has to do with Xi Jinping's campaign to purge the party, to neutralize enemies, to engage in an anti-corruption campaign, in quotes. Bureaucratically, people are afraid of doing anything that might raise the ire of Xi Jinping. Decay also speaks to Chinese attempts to now block information sources. They're talking about decay themselves in a sense, because they're saying we need to free ourselves and purge ourselves of the rot brought by too much Western spiritual pollution. So decay is, institutions that can no longer serve in dynamic ways a population that has grown hungrier for other types of needs besides material ones. But the other part of decay, I'd say, is societal. So you have the terrible demographic situation in China. You have, believe it or not, for this not yet wealthy per capita country, you have this aging crisis, this elder age tsunami coming. You have workforce shrinking. and you have some real economic stagnation due to reversals of market reforms and misallocations of capital and debt and so on. So I call it an infirm colossus. So it is indeed a colossus, but it growing infirmities.
So I think the same could probably have been said 30 years ago about 35 years ago about the Soviet Union. And many scholars have commented that one of the great miracles of the 20th century is that the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully. Are your hopes, do you sort of align that the collapse of the Soviet Union with a potential collapse of China? What is kind of the prognosis for a peaceful dissolution of the Chinese state as it currently exists?
Yeah, we used to say openly we wanted peaceful evolution. In the 90s we used to say that, and obviously that's an outcome that we can hope for. It's hard to effectuate in terms of the limits on U.S. Ability to influence that process. But I'd say it's different than the Soviets in the sense that it's far more richer and more dynamic. The society is more dynamic. Alongside this institutional and other decay, there's a growing middle class. There are people who are still getting more rich. So it's very contradictory in that way. The hopes obviously are that some of the groups that you mentioned before and other groups who are just tired of the Chinese system, do in fact come up with a more just way for China to govern itself. That wouldn't solve all our problems with China, but it would solve many, I think. And I think most high-level policymakers and politicians, at least in private, would say, that's an outcome we'd welcome.
Thank you. This next question also comes from the audience. It says, what are your opinions on Senator Josh Hawley's bill to ban TikTok and WeChat? Many Chinese Americans use WeChat as the only means of communication with family members at home, but the Chinese government uses it to spread Chinese propaganda and steal information from US citizens. Kind of part two of this question is, how important is it to get Chinese Americans to denounce their former government?
Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans are Americans. I mean, so
Chinese immigrants from China.
Yeah, or Chinese. So the problem on that is that China has a policy and a set of groups called, under the umbrella of the United Front, working groups that target Chinese nationals in the U.S. and Australia and other places, and expect Chinese nationals, not necessarily citizens of the United States or elsewhere, but expect them to do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party. Most of them don't want to. I mean, they're either happy citizens of their countries or nationals who just don't want any part of that. But they are being targeted. A separate question from WeChat, they're being targeted to do things against their will, often under threat of sanction of their families and so on back at home. Back on WeChat and TikTok, the U.S. concern over access, as I stated in my opening remarks about Chinese rather holistic view of, let's say, non-view of data privacy. There's no such thing as data privacy, and so the concern the U.S. and increasingly Europe and other nations have with access to people's individual data, this isn't the TikTok and WeChat are not national security threats, but they are threats to U.S. and Western ways of life, and so the U.S. and its allies can't abide those sorts of things where data will be sucked into China for use for nefarious purposes, for oppressive purposes, and so on. So again, very complicated issues because of the idea of how Chinese nationals or Chinese Americans communicate with their families and so forth. But perhaps there will be alternatives.
So I'll combine a few audience questions here, but we've got a few people asking about China's influence in American research universities. And I know recently there had been several investigations into faculty at Harvard who had failed to disclose financial support, which was provided to them by sources in China. How big of a source of disinformation, or how much does that concern you as a scholar of disinformation, that the top elite research universities have their financial debt, or are getting their financial resources from one of our strategic competitors?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was Harvard, right? It wasn't Yale, so it's hard to make tongue-in-cheek jokes on Zoom. But it's a concern, and so the United States has started something called the China Initiative at the Department of Justice, targeting very explicitly Chinese state-run technological acquisition programs. And the 1,000 Challenge program, what you mentioned at Harvard, is one of them. So it's not meant to target U.S. Chinese science and technology cooperation writ large. It's meant to target specific programs we know about that are meant to illicitly gather and pull out technologies and scientific knowledge. And that has to continue. And we are in a competition over some of these emerging technologies, and we certainly have to stop illegal behavior. Most of these cases have been made thus far based on actual commissions of crimes against U.S. law. So these aren't arbitrary procedures. The Harvard professor and others throughout the country have been violating U.S. law, and these are criminal cases. In some cases, are civil cases, but criminal cases based on various U.S. statutes that have to be enforced. And it's just that we're enforcing them for the first time, and we're chasing down violators for the first time.
Thank you. And I guess I should note, I think Yale was on the list of the
Yes.
February DOE, Department of Education investigation that was announced. I think there were several other schools.
Yeah, no, any school with elite research capacities would be targeted by various Chinese bodies for illicit foreign technology acquisition.
Right. Another question we have here from the audience is getting back to the pandemic and whether or not you think the pandemic could be seen as an opportunity for the U.S. to confront, and really the rest of the world to confront Chinese information dominance, as you put it, in a more aggressive manner. And this person suggests and maybe lead to some level of diplomatic isolation.
Well, some of that is happening. I mean, so the world isn't buying what China's selling on the pandemic. I mean, so attitudes in Europe have turned, attitudes in Australia have turned, and not buying that China was a responsible actor, or they don't like the way China handled everything from medical supply provisions to heavy-handed activities to change various political narratives in target countries about China and the pandemic. They don't like that China denies that it was the source of the pandemic, source, not man-made source, but source. So in some ways, it's just sort of a natural occurrence. The U.S. can do far more on the information front than it has been doing, in conjunction with allies, to target China for its, malignant behavior with respect to various dimensions of the pandemic, to include the safety, to include things that are putting pressure on things, to effectuate changes, safety of biolabs and wet markets and so on. But this is a big opportunity that the U.S. has to form a coalition that resists, malign activities of the Chinese Communist Party.
One of my questions is, a lot of the symptoms of decay, which you listed when we asked what your opinions were on sort of the nature of this decay within China, a lot of those ring true, I think, for the United States as well. So I'm wondering, is this sort of decay, is it almost more dangerous for the United States than it is for China?
Well, so the U.S. has a lot of problems. I'm not really a U.S. expert, but obviously we see things like debt and, as far as the eye can see, and we see things like an aging population and so forth, political stultification and so on. But look, comparatively, I mean, compared to China, I mean, we're having an election in November. Everyone could go vote and vote the bums out if they want, or vote the bums in. That just can't happen. There's no cathartic process like that in China. There's no outlet for that level of frustration. The U.S. People can say whatever they want, obviously, and have so many other means of civic life, as many problems as we may have, that China just doesn't. So the danger in China is that, is that, for those of you who studied the French Revolution, or Tocqueville's take on the French Revolution, it's that the points between the elites and the individuals, there's no sort of civil society in between. And if China does explode, the Chinese people do explode in anger, the outcome that we discussed before about a democratic future may not be the future. It's very dangerous, I think, to be both in decay and not really having any outlets to solve basic civic problems. So I guess my answer would be, I think most people would still take the United States over China in terms of where they'd want to live and study and work, by far, by a margin of, orders of magnitude.
I had another question from a slightly different perspective, and I guess this does relate somewhat to the propagation of Confucius institutes, and I guess Chinese foreign language think tanks kind of around the world. But I was reading recently about connections between the Chinese government and US organizations like the College Board, for example, and the amount of influence that the Communist Party of China is able to exert there. So I'm kind of curious, maybe from a more domestic perspective, how can we kind of prepare the next generation to deal with this issue, and how should we be educating young Americans about China? How should we take that approach, especially when Chinese disinformation is not a Chinese phenomenon only? Obviously that propaganda makes its way here and is openly allowed by different domestic organizations. So how should we approach that question?
The question of educating the next generation,
right?
These things take time. I mean, so there's two separate questions, and they're interrelated. One is Chinese influence over or attempts at influence over the university system in the United States, and mostly that influence is exercised through money, through how much dependence U.S. universities has on revenue from from Chinese programs, from Chinese tuition, and so forth. But as we see with the NBA and Hollywood, it's usually money and access that influences U.S. institutions with respect to China. On education, I mean, we almost need to start from scratch about how we educate about China. I mean, obviously some very good professors at your university but the assumptions, the assumptions about, in many courses on U.S.-China relations that still take us back to the assumptions that we had in the 1980s or early 90s, all have to be re-examined. Which begs a bigger question about U.S. strategic culture in general, and how it can get big countries so wrong so often. So these are huge questions that it's going to take a while to turn around the ship of universities and educational systems.
Another question sort of about universities and soft power. So how do you think universities like Yale should reassess their role and the impact of soft power? And so, for instance, Yale has its Beijing Center, Harvard has a center in Shanghai. There is a lot of this, sort of elite organizing that the U.S. does in China, whether it's state directed or not.
Yeah.
But do you think that should be sort of increased and re-emphasized, maybe at the expense of some of the more realist concerns over hard power and military buildup? What's kind of the correct tack for the
Yeah.
strategy?
Well, soft power is very important. I was involved with another elite university early on that wanted to open or did open in China, and I said, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, that you're going to face all kinds of problems in what you teach. There's going to be all kinds of caveats and stipulations and attempts to block certain things that you want to teach because of First Amendment and other basic rights. And I think a lot of universities are finding that to be true, or finding themselves to be self-censoring. And so in order to maintain access, so it's a clear trade-off. I mean, it's a trade-off for U.S. businesses. It's a trade-off, as I said before, for U.S. economic policy making. And people have to be extremely clear about what those trade-offs are and not fool themselves into thinking they don't exist, I think is a number one. And so, so universities are obviously going to reassess based on some of the cases being made on economic espionage, some of the bills in progress in Congress, and then it's their own experiences in China, and how much is it worth, A, to generate revenue, B, to try to shape Chinese students if to the extent we can measure how effective that's been, and C, against basic purposes of universities, right? And basic purposes are obviously free inquiry. So that there are clear trade-offs, and the people have to be clear-eyed about those trade-offs.
Another question we have, this says, how influential are companies like Disney, who filmed Mulan in the same province as Uyghur concentration camps? Why are concerns about the Uyghurs seemingly only coming to light recently when they've been happening for years? And this person says, I feel China's human rights atrocities are focused on less than other countries, perhaps. Why do you think that is?
Money. I mean, there's huge incentives to look the other way. The China has been a big market, and will probably continue to be for a while for U.S. And European companies. And take the case of Disney. I mean, why did they do that with Mulan? I mean, they want the China market to be open to them, and so. There's no, people might hide it in nobler terms, but that the motivation and incentives were clear there. And so it's in some senses easier to focus on Russian and Iranian human rights abuses because there isn't as much money at stake. And that's the sad truth of it. It's that, and then sort of a less jaded answer would be that the sort of focus on China has just intensified recently in the last couple of years. So it seemed the Uyghur problem seemed, for those of us who've been focusing on Chinese human rights abuses for a long time, we're sort of exotic animals. I mean, it just wasn't at the forefront of what people's concerns with respect to China were. But now that we're kind of, in a sense, discovering all the malignancies collectively through our newspapers and our media and our social media, we're now seeing, oh my goodness, I mean, there's also these concentration camps, there's ethnic cleansing and religious crackdowns, and so I think we're just kind of seeing it all very clearly all of a sudden.
Well, thank you again for joining the Buckley program this evening, Mr. Blumenthal, and thank you to all of our attendees. I wanted to remind everybody that Dan's book comes out in November. What's the exact day in November?
November 17th. But go over to Amazon and go order it. Yeah.
You can pre-order on Amazon now. So if you like,
let me also just offer, if people have follow-up questions, I'm easily accessible to students, through Buckley program or however you want to do it. But if people didn't get their questions answered now, feel free to follow up with emails.
Great. Well, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, and I hope everybody has a good night, and we hope to have you back sometime.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay.